having me.
And we'll also pull up the slides.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for everyone that's joined. I think this conversation is so important for everyone that cares about seniors in the community, and of course, everyone that cares about veterans. And of course, I would imagine there are many people on this call that care about both. So thank you all for joining. I really would love to start by talking about my story, kind of my background. I see many friends on the call that may have heard this story a few times, but I know there are probably some people that are new to me and new to Heroes Bridge. I actually am a nurse by trade. I'm trying to see if this is letting me advance the slides, Bridget. It doesn't seem,
Oh, I think that was me. I'm sorry. Okay, just let me know. I'll advance them.
Okay, sure. Yeah, you can go to the next slide.
Okay.
So anyway, I am a nurse by trade. I've been a nurse almost 30 years, which is hard to say. Time sure flies when you're having fun. I chose to specialize very early on in gerontology, which many of you probably know is the care of our older generation. And behind that story, though, behind that nursing career, I am also the daughter of a Vietnam veteran. My dad was a career Marine. He was in for 23 years, and he went to Vietnam twice. He went very early in 1964 when America first kind of really started doing things there. And then he went back in 68 and 69, which many people consider kind of the worst couple years, the height of the fighting. So he was there twice. And I think I brought that background of being raised by a Vietnam veteran, and all of the things that meant to my family and all of the things we went through in supporting him to my nursing career. So I always kind of noticed the older veterans a little bit more, and you can go to the next slide. I always also like to share that I decided to actually found Heroes Bridge because of a Vietnam veteran. I had seen these older veterans for years, many of them not doing well in their later years, and the VA and communities struggling to really meet the needs of all of our veterans, Korean and World War II, but also our Vietnam veterans were getting older. I had seen that for years, and it always bothered me. But one day, I was in the hospice field, and I was called to do an admission on someone that had been sent home from the hospital, and I was just given an address in Rappahannock County, and went to it and found out that home was actually a tool shed that someone had let him stay in their backyard. And all he had was a space heater. And then I knew he was a Vietnam veteran because he actually had his DD-214 and a Vietnam service medal. And I spent some hours trying to get him to a more appropriate care setting. And I was lucky because my hospice had an inpatient center and was actually able to get him transferred there. But just walked away. Somebody has to do something about this and at the community level, and decided to found Heroes Bridge. That was 2016. Expected it to be a very small organization just in our kind of 3-county area to help these older veterans. I just wanted to share that with you guys to know that the idea was really kind of sparked by a Vietnam veteran. Next slide, please. So the objectives of today's learning session, I'm going to share some statistics about our Vietnam veterans, and then we're going to spend some time talking about the history and special circumstances of the Vietnam War that kind of maybe causes a higher rate of mental health difficulties in our Vietnam veterans. We're going to talk about the most common presentations of psychological distress in our Vietnam veterans. And then, of course, talk a little bit about the response and consideration and what can we do, both as a community and all of you as individuals. I do want to have a couple disclaimers. When we get into the history of the Vietnam War, if there are any Vietnam veterans that are actually on the call today, sometimes that can be difficult for our Vietnam veterans to kind of like hear that and relive that. So if you want to go on mute or tap out for a few minutes while we do that, please do. It doesn't bother everyone. So, but I do want to kind of warn you of that if that is something that bothers you. And then I also want to talk about the suicide rate in all of our veterans. I don't go into the suicide issue very much in this presentation because it really almost needs a whole other presentation. I do reference it in resources, the National Suicide Crisis Line, but I didn't want you to think like, oh my gosh, she didn't even talk about that. It was kind of purposely left out because it's almost a whole different presentation. Next slide. So diving into some of the numbers, I always like to remind people that about half of America's veterans are 65 and older. There's been a huge focus on the veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan, as there should be. Our nation has been in conflict for 20 years and they need that support. I always say that if our Vietnam veterans had had the level of support that hopefully our Iraq and Afghanistan veterans have now, there wouldn't need to be a Heroes Bridge, but it's just important with that focus to remember there's a whole nother set of veterans that are getting older every day and need a lot of support. It numbers about 9 million are 65 and older. About 6.3 million Vietnam era veterans are around, and about 2.5 million of those served in country. And what that means is there were, of course, many servicemen and women that were in the service during the years the Vietnam War was going on. Not all of them were sent to Vietnam. Many of them served stateside. Of course, many of them served in different bases around the world, but about 2.5 million served in country, which means they were sent to Vietnam. They were on the ground at some point. Getting into some numbers in the presentation later, and the study's actually referenced on that slide, but there was a study done that we're going to talk about a few times, and there was a lot of data that minority Vietnam veterans report higher rates of psychological distress later. And there's a lot of reasons why that might be the case, but I always like to point it out that our minority, so our African American and Latino veterans, are showing higher rates of distress. Also, I'd like to point out that 58% of veteran suicides actually occur in veterans over the age of 55. We have engaged heavily on the suicide issue this year at Heroes Bridge. I read that statistic, and shame on me. I, in my mind, had always thought the suicide problem in our veterans was an Iraq and Afghanistan issue, but when I had to look at some numbers, it is not. It's actually our older veterans that are choosing self-harm at a little bit of a higher rate than our younger veterans. Next slide, please. So that study that talked about the minority veterans having a higher rate also had quite a bit of other retrospective data. It's referenced here for anyone that wants to take a deeper dive into it. The things that I pulled out of that study that I thought were pretty compelling is the risks of psychological distress for Vietnam veterans when they compared it to other older people in the older population that were not veterans. So they had 9 times the risk for post-traumatic stress. They had double the risk for depression and 6 times the risk for general psychological distress, which I had to kind of try to find out what they meant by that. And that was really, they defined it as having like anger issues, anxiety, things that didn't meet the criteria for actual diagnosis of PTS or depression, but they were still psychological related. And this is the part where we go into just a couple of slides about the history of the Vietnam War. I think it's really important for all of us that are working with these veterans to have at least a basic knowledge of what they went through, why we even went to Vietnam, and then some very special circumstances that were different about the Vietnam War than what our Korean War veterans and World War II veterans experienced. So again, if you happen to be a Vietnam veteran and these types of memories bother you, please feel free to go on mute and step away. A lot of our Vietnam veterans don't mind and actually like that people are talking about these issues, but I just wanted to do that disclaimer again. So the Vietnam War was actually another conflict that was part of the larger Cold War. The Korean War was just about 10 years before Vietnam, and it was a very similar situation. The communists had in North Korea had invaded South Korea. And we chose to get involved in that conflict just to kind of fight communism. And then just 10 years later, almost the exact same thing happened where communists in North Vietnam invaded the non-communist South Vietnam. And here we were again having to choose whether it was something we should intervene. Now, there are many theories as to why we got into Vietnam. The most, I think, kind of prevalent one is that President Kennedy did choose to intervene due to a belief in something called the domino theory, that if we let Vietnam fall to communism, it would possibly spread across the rest of Asia, that we should really intervene. But unlike the Korean War, Vietnam became much more long and protracted. The Korean War was roughly about 3 years, but Vietnam became much longer, and it actually lasted about 10 years, depending on which dates you choose. And some of the reasons for that was it spanned 3 different presidents, 3 different administrations. So Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon. And if you think about like our Afghanistan war and even our Iraq war, same thing, right? Like we had a leader that chose to become involved in a situation, and then the administration changed. And then they had different thoughts or different ways that we should kind of fight that war. That happened back then. So I think anytime when you're changing administrations, no matter the political beliefs, it just kind of really can drag things out. Another thing that was very different was there was a lot of social unrest, and not everyone was supportive of the war. And that was very different than World War II and the Korean War. Everybody at home kind of banded behind those conflicts, and that just wasn't the case in Vietnam. I think the territory itself was also very difficult for our servicemen and women. It was a very jungle-like climate and terrain that just we don't have in America. So our servicemen and women were not used to that. And then it was complicated also by the Vietnamese population themselves. So North Vietnam was led by Ho Chi Minh, who was a populist leader, and people loved him in the North and the South. So although we were based in the South and trying to defend them against the communists, there were many Vietnamese people that actually supported Ho Chi Minh. So our servicemen and women never really knew when they were in villages and when they were, on the front lines where people's loyalties lied. So that complicated the war effort quite a bit too. Next slide, please. So why the mental health issues? That slide I shared where it showed the statistics of the Vietnam veterans just having a lot of issues compared to the regular older population. There were things, as I said earlier, that were very different. So in World War II in Korea, whole towns of men actually went and signed up to fight. Like after Pearl Harbor, there would be a group of 20 or 30 men that would go enlist, and they wanted to, go defend Europe and Asia. And it was kind of like a group thing. In Vietnam, it's actually kind of sad because I think they were trying to protect our servicemen and women because back then when you went to war in World War II in Korea, you got sent over and you didn't come home until the war was over. So you're actually away from your families and fighting for 2 and 3 years. And when the Vietnam conflict happened, they thought, well, that's not good. Why don't we just send everyone on year-long tours, is what they called them. And they were trying to protect them, but they didn't really realize that cohesiveness of going to war as a group, and then probably more importantly, coming home as a group, they were really removing that dynamic. So men would actually be sent to Vietnam, literally dropped via helicopter into fighting where men had been fighting together, but they didn't know them. And then when their year was up, they literally just kind of plucked them out and sent them back home. And they didn't have that kind of brotherhood. Another thing is that 25% of the forces in Vietnam were draftees. Now, all the draftees I've ever met served valiantly. They knew their number was drawn and they were happy to do what their country asked them to do. But it was still a different dynamic. So my father was a career Marine. He had actually been a Marine about 10 years before Vietnam broke out. That was how he chose to support his family. He went into the military. He knew what his job was. He knew that if war did break out, he would go. That was his choice. The draft, you literally would get a postcard in the mail saying that you needed to report. And my father's experience was very different from a school teacher in Alabama that was just told to go fight for a year. And then when they came home, it was very different as well. So when my father came home from Vietnam, he returned to a Marine Corps base where everyone else had been in Vietnam. All the families' dads were in Vietnam. These draftees didn't have that. They were, fighting for a year. And then, as I said, they were just kind of dropped back in their hometown and expected to act like nothing had happened. So that was a complication for, 1 in 4 of our Vietnam veterans. It also, the violence of the war in such a relatively small country. So there were over 58,000 deaths in the country, about the size of California. Another thing about Vietnam is there really wasn't a front line. In other wars, you were either behind the front line or fighting on the front line. And in Vietnam, there was really no safe place. You were never safe, even if you were in occupations like administrative, or you were a cook. You could be bombed or mortared at any time. You were just never safe. And you also witnessed a lot of death and destruction, even if you were in so-called safe kind of occupations. So you either served with people that ended up as KIA, or you saw them, or you dealt with the aftermath. So it was a very small country to have so many battle deaths and injuries. The society had changed a lot in the Vietnam War. It was really a time in the late 60s of a lot of protest and civil unrest. Our country has been through that in the last 4 years. And I asked my mother, I was like, is this what it was like in the 60s? And she said it felt very similar. So there was a lot of unrest and protests going on just as a nation. And for the first time, it was really okay to question war. Like, why are we there and what are we trying to do? And another thing, it was the first time that war was televised. So people were actually seeing the war in their living rooms for the first time, which was not the case in Korea or World War II. The coping mechanisms of the 60s and 70s kind of set our veterans up to have poor coping mechanisms. So drugs and alcohol were no longer as taboo as they were in the past. Just living on the street or being a hobo was something that was common in the 60s and 70s. And divorce was no longer as taboo as it was in earlier decades. So if a serviceman came home and he was having anger issues. PTS was not a thing until the late 80s. So if your dad or your husband came home and he was having anger issues or was drinking, women would just leave. And I'm not making a judgment on that, but it was a different dynamic than what had happened in earlier decades. So a lot of these older veterans, well, I shouldn't say a lot, a certain percentage of our older veterans end up alone in their later years because they're estranged from their family support systems, basically for 50 years. And then I think the last dynamic I like to talk about is the fact that we didn't prevail in Vietnam. Eventually, South Vietnam did fall to communism, and we actually just evacuated our troops and left. And I think for those that had been there once or twice, had lost friends and seen all of the death and destruction that we talked about, it was really hard to reflect on that time in a healthy fashion, because in the end we didn't prevail, and that was not the situation in Korea or World War II. We were actually successful in combating communism in those conflicts. I really worry about our Afghanistan veterans for the same reason. The way Afghanistan fell in the end, I really worry about them. It's a very similar situation. So that's just a few of the reasons you might see a higher rate of mental health issues and psychological distress. There are probably 20 more that Vietnam veterans that were actually there could tell you about, other than what I've put on the slide. I did want to mention Agent Orange super quick, because in that study that I referenced earlier, they did note that Vietnam veterans that had physical health issues also had a higher rate of mental health issues. And there was nothing more physically devastating other than, veterans that perhaps had catastrophic injuries, lost a limb or something like that. There was nothing more devastating to our Vietnam veterans than the use of Agent Orange. So I always thought Agent Orange, when I was little, I thought it was actually orange, but I found out later it's clear, which made it more deadly. The reason they called it Agent Orange is because the barrels that they shipped it in had a distinctive orange stripe on it. So again, kind of like the troop rotations, it was intended to help the troops. That jungle-like terrain that we spoke about, the enemy was very successful in hiding in that terrain. So they figured they would spray the terrain with this herbicide that actually killed everything. And the map you see there on your right is everywhere that Agent Orange was sprayed. So it's pretty much everywhere, except for maybe the Central Highlands there a little bit. Our Vietnam veterans in the early 80s started having higher rates of cancer and just so many other diabetes, heart disease. And the VA fought it for a couple decades, actually, that it was not related. And they finally realized that it was the Agent Orange. And the VA now considers many cancers, diabetes, heart disease. They added hypertension. If you are a Vietnam veteran and suffer from any of those disorders, the VA automatically assumes that it was because of Agent Orange in Vietnam. And I just like to mention that because, as I said, the ones that suffered physical ailments did have a higher rate of mental health issues as well. So next slide, please. That wraps up just a brief history. And again, there are many series about Vietnam and our time in Vietnam. So that was definitely a nutshell version, but I just like everybody to have that background. Moving into what you might see with these older veterans. So our youngest Vietnam veterans are about 65 and 66 years old. So if you were as young as you could be, say 18 years old, and you were sent to Vietnam in the last year of the war, you would now be about 65, 66 years old. So any of your veterans that are between like 65 and 80, they may have gone to Vietnam, and you should be asking that question. The three most common presentations, again, from that earlier study that I referenced, they actually mailed surveys to about 45,000 Vietnam veterans, and 20,000 answered, which I thought was a really good response rate for surveys. But 20,000 answered, and the three most prevalent presentations from a mental health perspective, depression was number one. So 36% of Vietnam veterans said they were either experienced depression now or had been in the past year, I think is how they asked the question. So what you're going to see is sadness, loss of interest, decreased energy, sleep and eating disturbances. The second most common was post-traumatic stress. 18% said they were experiencing it or had recently experienced it. So nightmares, flashbacks, being startled easily, loss of interest in activity. And I think that goes hand in hand because often they avoid certain situations. They won't go in crowds, don't like to be around a lot of people. Certainly, everybody talks about fireworks, like that can, be kind of startling for them. And then there was also that general psychological distress that many of them, 10% reported, just kind of generalized anxiety or anger, other mood disorders that weren't well defined in other ways. So those are the three that you'll see the most common in the Vietnam veterans. And how to help. So as a community, and as an individual, I think there was supposed to be a picture there. There you go. But other than that, you can advance the slide. So the first thing I like to tell everyone is do not skip community-based care. I think one thing that we see at Heroes Bridge a lot is as soon as someone finds out they're a veteran, or they know someone that's having difficulty and they realize the person is a veteran, they try to get them sent to the VA. Like the VA should be taking care of this veteran, and absolutely they should. But the problem with that is it's not going to happen fast. Getting enrolled in the VA and getting support from the VA can take months. We literally, because we deal with an older population, we literally have veterans that die before the process is complete. So that's reason number one. Don't skip community-based care. Don't just go straight to the VA. The other reason is the VA care may or may not be what that veteran wants, or it may not be better care. And so a lot of our Vietnam veterans, and I've never, tracked this on a numbers basis, but if I had to guess, about half of them, one of their coping mechanisms, they don't have anything to do with the VA or the military or other veterans. They've kind of put all of that away in a box and they don't want to take that box out. So if you're trying to send one of those veterans to the VA for mental health care, they're probably not going to do it. And then, unfortunately, I do not villainize the VA. Our staff at Heroes Bridge meet so many amazing VA workers that love veterans every bit as much as we do, but it is quite a machine. It's too big to fail at this point. And in my opinion, it's like the lottery. When we send our veterans, they may get an amazing person and they may not. So the healthcare may be better and it may not. So just don't skip what's right here in our community, because our veterans deserve to have that care if that's what's going to help them more. So what do I mean by community-based? Another thing I think people skip is their primary care and family physicians. So if a depression case or a PTS case is not terribly complex, many of our primary care and family physicians can address and treat less complex issues. I'm blessed as a nurse to know many of our physicians in the community, and they do good work if it's not complex. And I also feel that many of them are very good at knowing when it does need referred, like, ooh, this is a little bit out of my specialty and I need to bring in. So some do need specialized care, but I just really encourage with our older population to not skip the primary care and family physicians. I think our older people also do that. Like they think their doctor takes care of their high blood pressure or certain things like that. And when they start having mental health problems, they kind of think I must go somewhere else. So also our local aging support groups that often aren't vet focused. We have an amazing nonprofit network in our area. And when I think of organizations like Wrap at Home and Aging Together, I would connect them to those. Not all veterans want to go to vet-based groups and networks. So don't forget our amazing aging support groups in the area. And also consider connections to local veterans organizations such as the VFW, the American Legion. Of course, Heroes Bridge, we're always looking to welcome them into our fold. I underlined consider because of that population that I spoke, that there are some that don't want to connect in that way. So consider it, ask the question, but don't assume that they're going to want to do that. And of course, our Mental Health Association friends and resources in our own community, definitely reach out. They have an amazing site where you can search for resources and everything. So yeah, that first slide is just to remind you not to skip what's right around us and probably that our veterans can get to the fastest. The next slide is talking about the VA. So every veteran should be screened for eligibility for healthcare and financial compensation. So those are two separate silos within the VA system. So every veteran could possibly be eligible to go to the VA for their healthcare. There is also a separate silo where if they are suffering from a condition that was caused by their service, they can actually receive a check every month. And that check can range from $300 up to about $4,000, depending on the severity. So I advocate that every veteran, young, old, should always be screened for that eligibility. It is quite complex. You need your PhD in VA to kind of do that. And that's why I have the next bullet. Having a VSO, a veteran service officer, is crucial. So a veteran can go on the VA website and try to sign up for stuff. We always recommend kind of having a doula through that process. Our favorite is actually the Virginia Department of Veteran Services. So the state of Virginia, some years back, decided, okay, the VA is hard to tackle. We're going to develop a department at the state level that helps our veterans connect to what they're eligible for. And they have a lot of VSOs, and they are, we've had really good experiences. Another thing with them is they have access to the VA system, which is like magic. So things get hung up in the system and they can go in and see like, oh, we made this application and it's hung up because of this, which a lot of VSOs don't have that level of access. So I recommend the Virginia Department of Veteran Services. However, there are many other good people. The DAV, the VFW, the American Legions, almost all have a veteran service officer in their ranks or more than one. So we really recommend that the veterans not try to do it alone. So if a veteran is eligible and is successful in being enrolled, I probably should back up just a moment. There is a common misconception that all veterans are eligible for all things within the VA. And I wish that were the case, but it just isn't. It's rather complex. And as many things as the VA made presumptive for our Vietnam veterans, all of those cancers because of Agent Orange and everything, none of the psychological issues for Vietnam veterans are what's called presumptive, which means if you have that disorder, you get enrolled easily. You don't have to prove that it was caused by your service. Unfortunately, that is not the case with the psychological issues. So, but if you are eligible and you are enrolled, the VA actually has some good counseling, of course, medication management, a lot of telehealth options they've added in for the ones that are successful in being enrolled. They've also, because of the suicide crisis, they've also tried to do some things that are available with or without eligibility or enrollment. And of course, probably one of the most important things that was done on recently is the 988 suicide and crisis hotline, and veterans just have to push 1 to get veteran specific help. We've learned a lot about this hotline in the last few months because we're really trying to integrate ourselves into suicide prevention more. I had the misconception that this hotline was kind of for veterans that were considering self-harm today. Like you're visiting with one or talking with one, and they're like, I'm doing something today. I found out that's not true. If you come across a veteran that is at medium risk, like I've had these thoughts, you can still call that hotline, and they'll still assess them, and they'll also connect them to the VA-based suicide prevention teams, which I never even knew existed. So every VA hospital has a team of people that are suicide prevention teams, and they will work with medium or high risk veterans. They'll follow them, kind of enroll them into their program. So we're learning a lot about that. The few people that we've worked with have been amazing so far. So consider that hotline for high risk and medium risk. Another thing that the advice they gave us that I never really thought about is they recommend, if you're working with someone on the phone and they're medium or high risk, to 3-way call the 988 number, because a lot of times you tell them, okay, I need you to hang up and call this. And then you're like, I don't know if they really called or not. But they said it's possible to 3-way call and introduce the veteran and stay on until they take over. So that was a nice little pro tip that they've taught us. There are also things called vet centers. I looked it up, and there's one in Leesburg, Alexandria, and Martinsburg. So unfortunately, there aren't any terribly close to us, but they are counseling and mental health 100%. That's what they do. And as far as I can tell, that does not require eligibility enrollment. Any veteran can walk into one of those centers and ask for help and be screened and be enrolled into that program. So next slide, please. So that's kind of like the community-based. If you're a provider or working in a professional level, those 2 slides hopefully gave you some resources and advice. This slide's a little bit more at the individual level, like what can you do if you know or come across a Vietnam veteran that just isn't doing well. I always like to say, go beyond. Thank you for your service. There is nothing wrong with thanking a veteran for their service. But, you know, if you do that and then walk away and you know that veteran's struggling, it's kind of not the best for the veterans. So just a few recommendations is to look around you and notice the veterans in your community. And for our older veterans and our Vietnam veterans, I think presence is the biggest gift you can give them. Visit them and let them talk if they want to. Not all of our Vietnam veterans want to talk about their experience, but many of them do. So visiting and letting them talk and just having presence is, I think, my biggest #1 recommendation. And then I think helping them with everyday difficulties. So as I said, not all, but a lot of our Vietnam veterans have ended up alone at end of life. So, you know, a lot of times when a person gets older and they start struggling, there's a niece or a daughter or someone that starts giving them rides or helping them with things. And with our Vietnam veterans, they just don't have that person. So helping them with everyday real things like rides and home repairs and yard work is very important. Also celebrating and honoring their service with their permission. So, you know, did they ever get their medals or did they lose their medals, and replacing them? We are very fortunate to have Amy O'Grady on our staff, who takes a lot of time with our veterans and hearing their stories, and she's able to get a lot of them in the local papers, and she does an amazing portrait series. So just kind of celebrating and honoring them. Many of our Vietnam veterans did not get that when they came home. So it's very important to try to do that while we still can. Encouraging them to social involvement and connection. So those groups I talked about, they can tend to self-isolate, which we all know is not healthy at all. So encourage maybe going to something with them. So encouraging that social involvement and connections. And of course, volunteering and or donating to veteran organizations in your community or senior serving. As I said earlier, you have both in your community, a lot of quality organizations. So volunteering and donating and financially supporting those organizations, I feel, is something everyone can do to kind of spread the love a little bit. And I think that is it. I'm trying to check the time real quick. That's a video that is amazing, but I think we might do better if anyone has any questions or thoughts or debriefing a little bit. I know that was a lot of information. I'm not sure, Bridget, if there were questions in the chat or if people just want to raise their hands, or maybe nobody has any questions.
I think you did great, Molly.
Thank you, Laura. It's good to see you.
Good to see you too. I give you a lot of kudos for what you're doing on that Battle Buddy phone program, what you're trying to start with that. Can you tell us a little bit more? I brought it up on the radio show, but I want to make sure I get it right so I promote it correctly.
Oh, good. Thank you. Yeah, we opened our Battle Buddy call center. We got 300 calls in 48 hours. So there are a lot of older veterans, and we're happy to have that avenue to help them.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. I think that's amazing. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt somebody.
On the phone. I'm hoping you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hi. Thank you. I know a Vietnam veteran that is having trouble navigating the medical center. And I was wondering if you have any recommendations for that. He really doesn't even want to use the services. And so even getting him to go there for doctor's appointments, and then he doesn't like the doctor that he's got, et cetera, wants to change doctors. Was wondering if you have any recommendations.
I would recommend he call us here at Heroes Bridge if he's willing to do that. We work with those situations every day. There's a lot to kind of unpack there, and that's what we love to do. So yeah, if you Google us, we should come right up, and we would love to help him if he wants help with that.
Is there a specific person that he should ask for at your staff?
You just call the main number, and our intake person will be happy to direct him from there.
Okay. And is that something that I could do as an advocate for him? Because like I said, I'm kind of thinking that he's not going to do it.
Absolutely. It's rarely ever the veterans that call us. It usually is someone concerned about them. So the intake person will ask you some questions. You may know the answers to half of it, but just tell us what you do know, and then we will reach out to him. We do just like to make sure that you've kind of told him, because often they won't answer if you haven't told them that we're going to be calling, but you absolutely can call us and tell us what you know, and we'll take it from there.
Excellent. And can you give me that number? I'm sorry that I'm on my phone versus online.
No, that's okay. It's I hope I know my number. That's like embarrassing. It's 540-341-5871. I hope. I never call us. I'm always here. So I literally never call us, but I'm pretty sure that's it.
You don't call yourself? Come on.
It's
Thank you so much. Amazing service you guys offer.
Just to clarify, it's 540-341-5378.
Okay, I was close.
Hi, I'm going to unmute myself for a second. Can everyone hear me okay?
We can hear you.
Hi, this is Jean Marie Corrado. I'm actually a veteran academic advisor at Laurel Ridge. So I work specifically with the veteran population, active duty, spouses and dependents, anybody using military education benefits or has the affiliation. And I'm so glad you mentioned DVS, Department of Veteran Services for Virginia, because we actually host the Veterans Resource Specialist at our campus the last Wednesday of every month. And it's actually starting August 30th. And she goes to the Fauquier campus in Warrenton at Laurel Ridge, and is there for a few hours, and then goes to the Middletown campus. That's, the end of 66. But we can share information, and she welcomes appointments, or if she meets people from the community. Her name is Danielle Cullers. Again, I would love to share her information, but it's just another stop and maybe an easier way to reach a resource specialist who can connect a veteran or advocate with services that they need. But she covers everything. She gets people in touch with vet center services, but also if you need your driver's license, this is how you can navigate that, or let me link you to somebody who can help you. So again, it's just something that we're starting again this fall, and last Wednesday of every month at the Laurel Ridge Fauquier campus.
Yeah, thank you for hosting, Danielle. That is an amazing service you guys have chosen to do, because the closest VDS offices are Manassas, and I think they have one in Stevens City. So they do amazing work, but yeah, it's hard for some of our older veterans to get there. So to have a day that they're coming here is amazing. Thank you for sharing that and for hosting that.
So when we were talking about the Battle Buddy call-in center, I was talking to Rachel, I think like a week or so ago. I was gonna see if maybe we could get CVMA, the Combat Veterans Motorcycle Association, to maybe help not only in Virginia, but if you have a list that's of people throughout the United States that's needing help. CVMA is in every single state, all over the states, and I know they would probably be willing to help you with your call-in center. I know you're getting calls for all sorts of stuff. So I don't know if we could somehow start working together on that. I think that could be something beautiful.
Yeah, Rachel mentioned that. I thought it was an amazing idea. Those are some pretty hardy veterans in that group. And yeah, I loved that idea. So happy to work with you on that. And thank you.
Great. Well, yeah.
Are there any other questions or thoughts on our Vietnam veterans?
You're doing awesome, Molly.
Thank you, Laura.
I wanted to ask a quick question about like resources. I work at a food bank, and we have people come in and do intake all the time. And so we have like a table of resources and outreach materials. Do you guys have like any sort of resource? I was just looking through a website to see if you have any resources that I could like add to the table.
Yeah, we would love to have some brochures. I know Amy's on the call. What food bank are you with, Hannah?
The Blue Ridge Area Food Bank.
Okay. If you're able to put just your contact information in the chat, or maybe you already did, and if Amy could perhaps like grab that for me, we'd be happy to get you some materials.
Yeah, I can re-add it. Thank you so much.
Okay, no, thank you.
Christine, do you want to share information about our Veterans Task Force? If anyone wants to join, I know there are some members here on the call. I don't know if she can unmute or not. But yeah, the Mental Health Association is working with some local veterans and the VA to have a Veterans Task Force. And if you're interested in joining us, we would love to have more people. The group has just finished their SWOT analysis and now are ready to get started to get busy. So that's the Mental Health Association.
Yeah, and I'll just add Christine's contact information in the chat.
Can I make a shameless plug for our veteran show? Sorry.
No, please mention that.
So my husband and I host a veterans radio show out of Baltimore, Maryland, every Saturday from 6 to 7 p.m. And we're fellow veterans, and we just want to, we've been through the very complex and crazy web of the VA and the charities and just even outside medical care and everything. So we decided that we wanted to start sharing what we've been through to maybe help others. If anybody knows a veteran that has a cool story or a veteran that needs help, right now we're highlighting a lot of people who are stationed in Uzbekistan. It's the people from Uzbekistan, it's like Agent Orange on crack. It's pretty brutal what they've been through, but we highlight different charities too, and we vet our charities like Heroes Bridge, our very first people that we had on, which did awesome, Molly. So if anything you need help with, if we can't help you, we'll find a way that you can. But we just ask if you can listen, or we upload our shows on the podcast on Buzzsprout too. So just the veteran show, just hit us up. We're new, but we're trying. So thank you for the shameless plug. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Laura.
Interesting. Thank you.